So I think I'll move straight into what we wanted to talk to you about today. So we want to reflect a bit about alignment versus diversity within the research culture topic. And of course, research culture is a kind of terminology that has emerged fairly recently, so it's still evolving, I think, as we speak, and bringing these communities together is part of that evolution. So there's a question around what is the right balance between alignment and diversity. Where does that sit for different dimensions of research culture? And how do the choices that we make in terms of balancing that in the right way also impact on the future of this movement? The choice of this topic has been in part inspired by a similar conversation that has been happening specifically on the topic of research assessment. So I was actually involved in a blog series of a range of blogs that was kind of looking at unanswered questions in relation to research assessment reform. And one of those blogs was really also touching on this kind of balance between alignment and diversity, and it was looking at in the case of research assessments, how do we kind of balance the search for global alignment and global principles with diversity that happens at the individual level, but also thinking, for example, about how do we have, on the one hand, organizations like DORA, COARA, FOLEC work together, and on the other hand, a lot of this real practical movement is driven by individuals with their own focus and their own real passion for certain aspects of the assessment landscape. And so, inspired on this kind of reflection piece, we came up with a tagline for assessment that we called "as aligned as possible, but as diverse as necessary." It's a bit the kind of counterpart of what we have for open science: as open as possible, as close as needed. And based on this blog, there was actually this inspired GRASP OS, which is a European project on open science, to have a community of practice talk around this. And I wanted to just share with you an interesting perspective during that session given by Sarah de Rijke. She talked about this kind of diversity versus alignment question in the form of the nested challenge, presenting kind of the different levels from the global principles to national frameworks to institutional policies, faculty implementation, and then the individual level as these kind of Russian dolls that fit into one another, but with a realization that where the highest levels need more alignment, the lower ones probably really benefit from the diversity. And so Ben and I were thinking, you know, is this similar for the research culture movement as a whole? And we thought it was an interesting reflection piece, because part of our initial realization was that for research culture, this question seems to be a lot more complicated even than for assessment that kind of sits as one of the topics under that umbrella. So what we wanted to do today is really look at 5 dimensions where we think this balancing act between alignment and diversity will be especially important in defining the future of what will happen with the research culture movement. So we'll work us through definitions of research culture, who is owning the discourse, what is happening in the funding landscape to make this happen, what do we do with collecting evidence and making sure that's distributed throughout the communities, and how do we ensure there's cooperation? So we'll look at alignment versus diversity for each of these themes throughout the rest of our session today. So let me start with a bit of reflection on the definitions. The terminology research culture has emerged actually quite recently, and it really emerged through these evidence underpinned, what I would call problem statements, and I'll come back to some of the first ones as an example for definitions. And this has really led to evolving definitions and discussions on how do we define what is in and outside of the kind of research culture terminology, something I think we haven't quite even landed on today. And of course, there's the additional complexity that many of the components within the umbrella already were existing as journeys of travel or journeys of reform on their own. For example, I think the open science movement has a really advanced trajectory. Research assessment has also seen increased momentum more recently, but there's other topics that are very firmly fit within the research culture umbrella, such as leadership, where perhaps we haven't seen that same movement. So there's already this diversity of topics and also the challenge of alignment between those topics that brings an additional layer of complexity here. And then there, of course, is the question towards the future: who really gets to define what is in and out of this definition? And also, do we need full alignment on those definitions to be able to move forward, or is that not a necessity? That's probably a question to kind of bring back to you maybe for the final part of this session, where we'll go in dialogue with you as our audience. So where has alignment and diversity kind of been showing in the context of definition? So this is almost a kind of quick history, I think, of those who have been really involved in the definition setting so far. So the journey started with reports, but based on co-creation and engagement with communities by the Nuffield Council on Bioethics and the Royal Society. And these reports were really initial problem statements of common problems, but of course, they decided to include or exclude certain topics from that discourse. Then there was, of course, the Welcome program that Ben was involved in, where there was a clear increased focus on the people element. It wasn't as broad as the initial research culture discourse where it started. So that kind of redefined where to focus. And I do think that had an impact on what were the priorities in the government strategy on this. Then more recently, Vita and Shift Insights for UKRI developed a framework that I think perhaps brought us, again, closer to alignment, and it included, I think, more topics again within the definition. But of course, in parallel, institutions have been defining their own definitions. And we've had, it was already said, we had some interesting discussions with some of the people coming in as speakers yesterday evening, and we had actually some discussions at my table around, you know, how do we define what to work on? There was one example where it's very much driven by the community needs and surveying the people at the institution, whereas another perspective was, you know, we're very resource constrained, and it also depends partly on the passion of the people who are willing to volunteer their time. So, you know, there's definitely this diversity that we see in very different forms at the institutional level. And then I think there's a layer on top of that where we're starting to see European interest in the topic of research culture. And I think James will be speaking later from Science Europe, who have been actually working on, can we develop a framework, even, you know, at the level of Europe, let alone the UK alone, to look at, okay, what is in and out of this definition. And then, of course, we are also now looking at the integration of a PC element within the ref, for those to whom that is relevant. I know that's not all of you in the room. And there's, I think, questions at the moment on how that is going to impact how research culture is defined and what will be in and out, and whether that will be driven or not by the ref. I think there's probably, I see trajectories for both directions, but it will depend on how that PC element, people, culture, and environment element is ultimately delivered. And so the kind of conference theme today is from principles to practice. So we wanted for each of the kind of dimensions that we're touching on also give some examples of where that's started to be guided by principles, but later on in the themes you'll also see some examples of how that's kind of going into practical initiatives. And so for the definitions, I did want to touch a bit on just sometimes the kind of conditions that sometimes this is driven from, because of course Ben and I have had insights in the in and out discussions at the Royal Society and Wellcome Trust respectively. And I think one reflection there is that at the Royal Society, for example, some of the kind of in and out discourse was driven by the organizational structure. So within the conference that we delivered at the time, the big teams were career development, research integrity, competition versus collaboration. And there were notions towards open science and towards inclusion and diversity, but they were much less visible. And that had to do with the way that there were separate teams working on those topics within the organization. So there was less room for the actual research culture team to kind of work on those. And I think it's important to understand these contextual considerations, because I don't think as a community we want those type of conditions to determine how we define what's in and out of research culture. And there's probably a link to the next theme on ownership, on how we ensure that research culture is defined, taking into account those more pragmatic considerations that come from those who are trying to help with that exercise. And I understand from Ben that at Welcome there were also discussions on what to focus on, and it was partly also based on what people were familiar with already, which domains were already within the portfolio. So I think that's just an interesting practical reflection on the definitions piece. And I think with that, I'll hand over to Ben to cover the next two themes.
Thanks, Karen. So I wanted to move us on to the second dimension that we wanted to talk about today, which was around ownership. And this was very much trying to consciously take stock of the fact that the research culture community has really moved through a fascinating period in the last 5, maybe 6 or 7 years, going from something that was very small, frankly. I remember a time when we started on working on this in Welcome, it was hard to find people across institutions working on this. And now we see that we have kind of people nominated with research culture in their job titles. We see kind of emergence of a much stronger community. And we have a packed room today, which is actually wonderful to see. So I think there's a really interesting process that's still underway, which is this shift from something that was at times quite fragmented, often across, as Karen's talked about, different areas that were being worked on at different areas of progress, to something that's become a lot more coherent and a lot more collaborative, which is fantastic. And I think within that, we've seen, obviously, the movement in of larger voices, and particularly funders. They have a natural gravitational force. It's a really interesting moment when they move into the conversation and what effect that has in terms of where the community's ownership sits. And I do think across all of that, there's been a real desire to keep that kind of broad sense of collective ownership across the research culture conversation. And I think a lot of the organizations that have got involved have really tried to put that at the heart of how they work. But within that is still a question of who owns the research culture conversation? Where does that stem from? Is that changing before our eyes right now? And is it changing in the direction we'd like it to? And within that, I think we see again the benefits of both alignment and diversity. You see a whole set of kind of founding voices, that relatively small community that we start with. Many of those people are still here and are really kind of continue to push this issue that they've been championing for many, many years, often decades, being unheard. And I think it's really fantastic that we've got that kind of really core base of incredibly passionate advocates. I'm always taken by the fact that when we were starting some of these conversations back at Welcome many years ago with the Reimagine Research Programme, there was an enormous amount of alignment across that group about what needed to change. And actually, the benefits of it being so small meant that they could all sit around a table, and there was a real sense of, genuine friendship, community, collective kind of endeavour that meant that actually alignment was easy. It was almost natural within that group. And I think there's a real question now as this community continues to grow and diversify in a really positive way, is how do we continue to have that alignment and that connection? And it's why days like today are incredibly important to help us all share ideas and to have common touch points. Within that time, we also saw some interesting kind of additions, funders coming in. We've talked about the Royal Society, Welcome. We also saw UKRI take a greater role in this. And I was very lucky to be involved in the government's People and Research Culture Strategy in the UK, which again was an attempt to think about what was required in terms of centralising strategy. Was there a gap for that? Was there a need for the government to set out what it saw as a vision for research culture? And I think there's a really interesting question about what are the components, the structures that our sector needs in order to be able to have that alignment? Is it strategies from government? That one is getting quite old now in the UK. There's no real sense of what comes next from it. I think there's some really interesting questions for us as a community, particularly within the UK, of what do we want from government on this? How much direction do we need? What role do they play in this conversation and in terms of ownership? But I think all within this is a real sense of trying to get the best out of alignment. I know when we're at Welcome, we thought a lot about how do you do your best to really kind of harmonize the requirements that you're putting out there as a funder to reduce the burden and the requests onto the research community, but also trying to align the incentives. You know, if you're an early career researcher, you want to have confidence that the things that you're being measured against as your success metrics are going to be true if you move somewhere else or if you wait 5 years. I think there's a real risk within all of this, which I think is a really interesting one for us to take very seriously, which is those that we're asking the most of are those early in their career, and they also have the most to lose. If we change the measures of success, if we shift the conversation somewhere else, and if we, water down some of the reforms that we're looking for, it's those individuals who will suffer because they've invested in this new idea of a different approach. And if we return and retreat slightly back to more traditional approaches, they're the ones who'll be left stranded. So I think there's a real need to think about how we do make sure that we're reducing that kind of burden and really aligning rewards for people. But also we want to embrace that diversity as well that comes with that. We see that institutions now are really barreling ahead with institutional research strategies that have culture at their heart. We've already heard about that today with Queen's, about having that right at the core of the kind of university's mission. And I think there's a real benefit from that, about being able to see that kind of co-creation with research communities ongoing, and the mix of institutions focusing on their priorities. What are the strengths? What are their gaps? How do they kind of address that in a way that is tailored to their community and really reflects the needs of the people at their institution? And I think really embracing that is incredibly important, and we don't want to lose that with these kind of alignment structures that maybe sit above them. We also want to see space for interest groups, and I think that is something that has really, again, emerged and strengthened, I think, over the last few years, is groups who really share a particular common cause, a priority that they want to see reflected in research culture, and really having a space to champion that. And I think within the development of those big, cross-institutional strategies, but also within institutions, we want to make sure that there's continued space for those voices to be heard. And I think the really positive thing that I've seen emerge over the last couple of years that relates to ownership is a real collective voice. And I think moments like today, we've got things like the Research Culture Enablers Network based in Warwick. You've got Wellcome with its recent funding program having a community of practice that they're building around that. I think there's a real desire within all of these efforts to make sure that there are connection points for institutions and individuals. And there's questions about what do we need to fill in the gaps there? What's missing? Karen and I are really fortunate to be working with COARA at the moment on a good practice exchange. What model? What would that look like? Is there a gap there for something that's missing across the sector to help share ideas? And I think, again, it's just good for us as a sector to be very conscious about those decisions, to really push ourselves constantly to think about what are the structures and the pieces that we're missing in the puzzle. And I just wanted to kind of reflect back on something that has stuck with me from my time at Wellcome, which was, I showed you on a couple of slides back one of the cafe culture kits, which is something that we designed to try and decentralize the inputs that came into the Wellcome program many years ago. And those were kits. It was a kit in a box which gave you a whole series of prompts and stats from some of the research that had been done with the research community. And it encouraged people to sit down over a coffee and discuss their own experience with their colleagues of research culture, what it could be, what they would like it to be, and what their current situation was. And within all of that, that wasn't just a kind of tokenistic exercise. We asked people to feed back their ideas. What came out of it? What needed to change? What would they like to see within the research culture space to help things be reformed? And we built a Ideas Hub website, and each one of these boxes is a conversation that happened, and there's lots more. I just took a snapshot of the website. These are people sitting down, taking the time to really discuss with their colleagues what needed to change and sharing their ideas. And this has stuck with me for many years, which is there is not only a necessity to do this collectively, but there's a real appetite. People really want to own and contribute to this conversation. So keeping this open as possible and making sure that the structures we put in place don't stifle this real passion, I think is absolutely essential. And given that reform is always hard, it always requires patience and difficult decisions, the more that the community feel that this is owned by them and serves their needs and their aspirations, the more we'll be able to be ambitious with our reforms. I also wanted to talk about our third dimension, which is around funding. And it's something I've worked in throughout my career, is worked in different funders, and money always speaks. It always has a huge disproportionate level of influence over what gets done and what people decide to prioritize. Again, the research culture movement has gone from a place with virtually zero resource to one where there is starting to be emerging pockets of funding. And I think there's some really interesting questions about who has access to those, what are they supporting, what are they encouraging, And also, are they knitting together into a really coherent set of funding opportunities that support ideas to grow and be implemented and evaluated and shared? And I think we're really interested in how the nature of the funding that's available influences the mix of collaboration versus individualism. And I think we've already mentioned REF in the UK being a very interesting force that we're going to be watching over the next couple of years of the impact that has. Within this space, I think what we have is a mix of funding that is, again, incentivizing different types of approach to research culture. We have some fantastic funding that's out there, particularly from the Wellcome, which is obviously supported today, also from the Red Fund with Research England, which is just with an England-only fund within the UK. Both of those are really driving collaboration, and I think the All-Ireland group that we've got here today is a really good example of the fact that the structure of that funding has encouraged universities and institutions to work together, to find common ground, to spot common goals, to share ideas. That shouldn't be taken for granted. That's not necessarily a natural thing to immediately happen without the right type of funding in place. And I think the signals that are coming from those funders about really pushing collaboration is essential. But we should also be mindful of who's eligible for that. What are the conditions that we're putting around those funding, and how does that shape who's in and out, again, of that conversation? But we also want to have space for people to experiment and try different things. And it might be that some of those do need to be a bit more of an individualistic approach that's more tailored to the environment of a different institution. Within the UK, and particularly within England, again, there is some block grant funding that's available to institutions. That allows them a delegated level of ownership to decide what their priorities are and how they want to deploy that. I think that's a really good part of the mix. It does mean more individualistic working, but I think that contributes to the more collective endeavors that are funded elsewhere. But also, I think it's important that it's helping supplement what we're seeing as really squeezed funding within the UK at the moment. Universities are under a huge amount of pressure from government funding, and kind of dedicated institutional funding from internal sources has really been squeezed. And I think I don't really see that changing in a positive way in the future in the UK, at least. So finding sources of external funding that still encourage that kind of internal experimentation are going to be really important. And as we've said, across all of this, I think REF is the monster in the room that is looming over a lot of the sector. I think it's a really positive development that we are seeing research culture emerge in that mechanism and that assessment mechanism. I think it would have been a real turning point if we hadn't been included, actually. So it's, I think, a necessity. It has to be something that is seen as valuable and important. And the REF is done on a 6 or 7 year cycle. So if you miss this time, you have to wait a very long time to get into the next one. But that is also causing a conversation about, well, what are the measures of success? What are we assessing institutions against? How do we do that? What are we collecting as evidence? It's also driving competition. REF is a zero-sum game. There is a pie, and people will try and get the largest slice they can from it. And I think there's a real challenge there about what influence does that have on the approaches to research culture over the next couple of years. And I really do think that we are reaching this kind of turning point, and a really big question within the UK about what happens next between institutions is, what effect does REF have? And we've been having some really interesting conversations with many of the organisers of today and others in the room about how the island of Ireland offers a really interesting opportunity to understand what that sort of national level assessment process does. REF is replicated in different forms across lots of countries in the world, and Ireland has a really interesting opportunity here to look across the north and the south as two jurisdictions that are going to implement this differently. At the moment, you have a really coordinated, aligned, quite harmonized conversation about research culture across the border. It's a very porous conversation at the moment, and I think that gives you a really interesting baseline to work from. In that, in the north, we're going to see REF conversations already gathering pace. Karen and I have been involved in some of those. It's already starting to permeate into people's mindsets. And I think there's a really interesting question of, over the next few years, how do we see deviation from that baseline across each side of the border? How does that offer some lessons about the impact of how you deliver a national level assessment that is inherently competitive in a way that doesn't starve out some of that cooperative nature of the conversation that we've already had? And we're really interested in how to capture this moment, because it unfortunately is a time-limited opportunity. REF is about to take hold, and there is a chance to get a baseline that will disappear probably within the next 6 to 12 months. So we're really interested. If this is of interest to you, do come and talk to us at one of the breaks, but we're really keen to try and think if we can deliver a project like this to develop some evidence that I think would be incredibly useful to everybody. So I will hand back to Karen to talk to us about the last few dilemmas.
Thank you, Ben. So the kind of fourth dimension we looked at was evidence, and I think obviously, progressing research culture means we want to also know what works and also what doesn't. And I think research culture has also come with expectations of having a positive impact on fairness, but also on the research, the quality of research, the impact of research. So there's also questions around, is there some way in which we can look at those impacts in the longer term, and are we achieving these kind of areas where there was expectation? I think a big caveat here is that we need to also understand that what works in one context might not in another, and that will be an important consideration. But nonetheless, I do think there's an important question here on how we can effectively aggregate diverse evidence sources with that previous caveat very much front of mind. And here also, I think we are seeing developments in the last few years. So in terms of alignment, I think RORI is definitely, the Research on Research Institute is definitely started to play a role in trying to building the evidence base needed to realize the full potential of research, which is, I think, their mission statement. Although I think they are very focused still on research assessment and how funding systems work. The other big player here in the last years is the UK Reproducibility Network. They did this project called Meteor, which concluded, and one of the big findings were that evidence-informed decision-making on research culture issues in the UK is not really embedded yet in institutions. So they are now doing actually a follow-up project called COMET that looks at improving decision-making within institutions by facilitating this evidence-informed practice. And of course, the need here is to bring together a lot of the evidence that's collected at individual institutions on user experience, but also on outcomes and impacts and what this actually means for researchers. And I think Ben already mentioned that we're working with VITA. Jolana's here as well, representing VITA, RENT Europe, and also actually UKRN, especially because of their evidence angle, on thinking about developing a good practice exchange. Obviously, this is something where UKRI is looking just at the models at the moment. We'll have to see how it develops and whether we'll see it come into fruition. But I think an important role of that exchange, if it does roll out, will be to think about drawing together evidence and ensuring there is mutual learning within the community. And the example here I wanted to draw on is one, again, more from the assessment reform. So one study that Ben and I worked on last year was an evaluation of implementation of a narrative CV by the Swiss National Science Foundation. And I think, if you're interested, the report's online, and we're looking really both at user experience, how are applicants and reviewers finding working with such a format, but we're also already starting to dig into a bit the kind of text analysis of narrative CVs. Are people mentioning broader contributions? What is the impact of boosting language? Is that playing a role or not? So, do have a look at the report. But I think one realization we had when we brought the evidence together is that the project itself didn't really allow us to go and compare what other funders have found out, because there's several of the evaluations have now happened in Luxembourg. Cancer Research UK in the UK has also done its evaluation. Health Research Board Ireland has done an evaluation. So we actually then applied for a meta-science grant to look at all these different evaluations and do a meta-analysis, bringing all this evidence together. And I think we'll need several similar exercises to cover a lot of the different topics under research culture to start and really generate this kind of common knowledge base that really can help decision-making in the future. But again, there we have this diversity that will be also encouraged by the REV. There will be an incentive to collect more information, but maybe not yet established challenge as to how we're going to bring all that information together in a way that's useful and manageable, right? Because it will be a lot of information to deal with. So I think an important question also for the future, how we're going to make the most of the evidence that will be collected increasingly over the coming years. And then the last area we wanted to touch on is cooperation. Of course, research is really global in nature. And I think one of the themes today is also researcher careers. We know that researchers are mobile, so I think there's a lot to think about in terms of ensuring we don't put barriers to that mobility. And so cooperation across borders also for research culture is an important theme. But at the same time, and I think this is where there's still a very big difference between the research assessment reform movement and research culture in its kind of emerging nature, starting more in the UK and Europe. The perspective and the ambitions around research culture, if you want to make it global, should not be dominated only by those who started the conversation. And we can see and expect tensions from differing value systems, but also competition over funding that will put tensions in establishing that cooperation. And there's also a question around, what does aligned as necessary look like for effective global cooperation on the research culture topic. In terms of alignment, I think Ben's already spoken about a lot of existing networks, but I think there's also, again, a question on a potential role for the good practice exchange as a new cooperation hub. Science Europe is also really working at the European level at ensuring there's at least a framework to kind of enable that type of collaboration at that level. And I think at the global level, while research culture terminology is not universally adopted, we do see a growing focus on research culture umbrella themes. And I think naturally there will be a realization at some point that a lot of those are interlinked, and it will make sense to create something similar to the research culture terminology that brings those things or allows those things to be looked at holistically. Of course, on the other side, we've already talked a lot about REF. There's really a tension there of integrating an intrinsically collaborative set of reforms into an ultimately competitive exercise. So it's to be seen how that will impact on cooperation also between those at different institutions working on research culture. And globally, I don't think the geopolitical situation is making it very easy at this time to align globally, even at the level of values and principles. So there's some tensions there as well that we need to be aware of. And so the final example we wanted to show here is a project we did for the Inter-Academy Partnership. This is an organization that brings together academies from all over the world. And they asked us to do a survey and interviews with a range of academies all over the world to really think about how can we as an organization support our members, given that they're all at such different points in their journey around thinking about research culture. And I think maybe two realizations to kind of point out at the end here of the 5 dimensions. So one realization here, and this is kind of the quote there from the Zimbabwe Young Academy of Sciences speaks to that. One realization was that even within countries, there's a lot of diversity. So that alignment within countries is a starting point to still work on. But then on the other end, from the diversity to the alignment, I think one thing we also realized is that we could actually come up with a typology of groups that were at different stages in their journey on how each of these groups could be served and helped and encouraged to move kind of to the next step. So that was really showing us that there is, if you really put the effort in and you want to, you're able to go for a bit of a tailored approach, there is really things that can be done to encourage alignment even across such a vast membership with all these kind of different perspectives. So I think that is encouraging to see that I think that balance will be possible. And with that, I'll hand over to Ben for final reflections before we come to you.
Thanks, Karen. And this is the last slide. And just to say that what we've spoken about today, these 5 dimensions, they're 5 choices. They're not 5 problems, which is good. They're 5 choices. And I think it's about being conscious about what outcomes we're choosing across these as a collective community. However, we're also doing that in a changing backdrop, and we have to be conscious of that and the effect that it has on the choices we make. Karen's already mentioned, I think the geopolitical situation is changing quite rapidly, as we all know from the news at the moment. And I think there's a real question about some of the core values that this community hold dear being really threatened and put under pressure. What does that mean? How do we address that? How do we respond to that as a community and as collectively? But also it's shifting the availability of partners and the ability to kind of share these things around the world. And I think, again, it comes back to my point earlier about the people who end up paying the price for that are the researchers themselves, who lose potentially the chance to be mobile across different research environments. So there's a real desire for us to think carefully about how we hold firm in the face of a changing geopolitical landscape. I think there's also that question about funding. This is particularly acute in the UK, but we are seeing rising expectations amongst the researcher community. Great. Decreasing funding. And I think there's a real question about how do we meet that demand and do justice to it, to ensure that we haven't built up expectations and then walk away from this because it's too difficult and expensive. And I think there's a real appetite for sharing cost-effective solutions, and that's about avoiding duplication. It's about sharing what works and what doesn't, really trying to be as efficient as we can and collaborative as we can as a sector. But also, I think that goes back to Karen's point about then engaging with other areas around the world who, again, might be in very low resource settings, is actually cost-effective solutions are useful to everybody. So we should really try and find those and share those. And then finally, that question about this shifting pattern of competition versus cooperation. I think that we really need to fight to protect the cooperation that's within this room. I mean, the kind of hubbub outside over the coffee was just wonderful to hear. It's a really lovely community, and I really hope that in 5 years and in 10 years, it still feels as close and collaborative. I think we should really fight to protect that. That's not a natural given thing. We have to actually choose to keep that and to really prioritize that in how we work. So we really want to think about what are the things, if we prioritize cooperation, what are the structures and the frameworks and the funding types that we need to have in order to keep that? And how do we go out there and advocate for those and secure those? And I will say that you'll have seen through these 5 areas that we've discussed that we think there's value in both alignment and diversity. There's elements of both that we want to keep. And it's about trying to make sure that we're using knowledge exchange to be able to share stuff between those two areas of work. But fundamentally, I do think that trying to go for that element of kind of structured diversity is a really, really positive outcome for us as a community. I do think it's, there's some difficult things that we've talked about today. It's a little bit of a heavy start to the day, so I do apologize for that. But what I hope you're taking from it is that actually, there's a lot of assets that our community is going into these situations with. We've got a fantastic set of passionate advocates across lots and lots of institutions. We've got a really deep well of ideas. We've already seen that today. We've got really supportive funders. There's a moment of cooperation and openness that is not to be taken for granted. And we have that sense of shared endeavor. Like, that is a really fantastic foundation to build a movement from, to pursue reform from. And it's something that leaves us in a really positive place to go and answer some of these difficult choices. So I hope that you can take from this talk that we are starting from an enviable position, but we should really value the things that we have in this room and the connections that we already have. And what we're looking at is a challenge, but rather than a challenge of having to try and build momentum, which is where most movements struggle, we're actually about choosing how to direct it. And that's in our hands, and we should make those choices as consciously as we possibly can to make sure that in 5 and 10 years' time that we are building a community that really reflects what we want it to be and that is able to deliver the reforms that we want. So hopefully that's been a spur for some thoughts, and Karen and I have got a few minutes to take questions, but thank you very much for listening to us.
Hi, it's on. Yes, hi. Catherine Welsh from UCL. I'm really interested in the sort of diversity of voice question. Research doesn't sit in isolation, and neither does our culture. Any thoughts you have on how we can learn from and include and value voices from outside of the sector when we're having these debates? Thank you.
I think it's an important question. Actually, one of the conversations we also had yesterday at the table is that there's actually other sectors that struggle with similar problems, and it's often where there are specific power relationships that are hard to be managed. So I do think it's something that's underused. I remember actually when we were working on the research culture program, we brought in people who were working with top athletes around the Olympics, because there's also a tension of keeping a team together that's in a very competitive environment. And we actually learned a lot at the time from some of the lessons they had drawn to improve that kind of approach kind of year on year. So I think it is a good point that I think we have to maybe pull in more of those other examples going forward and learn from those. And then my focus is really on research assessment also, partly. And I think there as well, we know that there's a lot to learn from non-academic sectors in how that specific area is approached. And it seems to still be a gap of being able to pull evidence also across from other sectors. So I think you're absolutely right that there's really an opportunity, maybe also within the cooperation dimension, to really think about, can we expand this out to learning from other sectors, because there's probably a lot of missed value there. Don't know, Ben, whether you want to add anything.
Just very briefly to say, I completely agree. I think trying to break open the community as much as possible and bring in other voices. I remember when we were doing the research culture strategy with government, the minister at the time, the science minister, was Amanda Soloway, and her background was in HR, in business. And she was shocked when she saw the data and the results of what was happening within research. And her question to us was very direct, which was, do you think the tax-paying public would be happy with this outcome? You know, they are supporting a lot of this research, they're funding it. Yes, they care about what research produces, but they also care about how it gets done. And that is part of your license to operate as a sector. And it was a real wake-up call, frankly, because I think it gave, certainly me and others, I think, a sense that action wasn't an option, it was a necessity, and that we had to be really conscious of the fact that research benefits from having support of society, of the public, of taxpayers, and actually bringing them into the conversation and making sure their expectations are met is just as important as the ones within this room and within the research community itself. So I think the more that we can be open and porous to those who are involved in the research process, even if it is very distantly, I think it needs to be something that does serve a kind of societal goal of research being done well as producing positive things.
I think there was a question next there.
Hi, Steve Meany, Technological University Dublin. So I suppose I have one kind of observation and then one question. The observation is that the competitive nature of the current research environment, I think there's an implicit contamination in that is almost unresolvable. And I'm not really sure there's a way around that, because there's a philosophical and political underpinning of that I don't think we can, as a community, even if it's a diverse one, even if it's as porous to as many external opportunities as possible, I don't think that's fundamentally resolvable. And I think we need to maybe take a step back and look at it through a political and philosophical lens as well. And I suppose the analogy that I would take with that is looking back on the early days of regulation in the medical space and how that actually evolved from recognizing that self-regulation with that diverse set of cultures that's contextualized to our environment, that did not work. And that there had to be an agreed value system that everyone got behind to do activities in a particular area. And I'm sure everyone is familiar with the Declaration of Helsinki. That was originally scripted by 3 people, okay? And now it has provided itself as a fundamental framework for correct and appropriate behavior, albeit in a Western way of thinking, but it still has a fundamental influence on all practices and cultural aspects, because that filters through all sorts of regulations at a European and indeed global level. So that's the kind of the observation piece. Really happy to see that metagaming piece that you mentioned, Ben, about, you know, people saying, oh, there's research culture here. I'm going to performatively put in some stuff about research culture because that gets me money, and then I'll pretend to do something about it so that when I report it later on, I'll have something nice to talk about. But what I want to ask specifically then is, both on the back of that, there's a lag period in relation to KPIs from research culture. And is there a tendency, back to that box-ticking exercise, performative piece, is there a tendency to go towards things that are easy to recognize because they look like we're making progress, but it's actually smoke and mirrors?
I mean, there's a lot of points in there. I'm thinking where to start. I mean, I think on the last point, so I think several people here are probably involved in the RefPC pilots, and I think this is, you know, a question that sometimes comes up. We have had a lot of discussions around authenticity in those responses, and I think that comes back a bit: is this box ticking, or is this an approach where the community is engaged? There's feedback loops, and I do think. In the part for whom it's relevant, again, the ref will play a role in directing which of those will be valued. So I think there is thinking around how do we avoid the box ticking. But we'll have to see how that plays out. Do you want to pick up on any other while I think about the other points? Ben?
Yeah, no, I think it's a really interesting point around how you avoid just treating symptoms and chasing kind of short-term easy wins. So I think there's a real challenge, because I do think in some ways you do need to be able to show some progress, both to funders and to the community. So I do think it's helpful to find things that there are immediate interventions that we can make, even if the payoffs are long. But I do agree with you that I think we need to find the voices and the structures that allow us to look at what some of the fundamental problems, the sources of these issues are, and try and offer some solutions to those. I think the challenge with that is that they sit so far above a single institution, many of those problems. They aren't baked into the way that the sector operates, in a way that almost we forget is a choice. And I think having the right voices come forward and push through a process that allows us to look at those with fresh eyes, given the space and time to really think creatively about it, would be incredibly powerful. The challenge is that needs such deep buy-in from the funders, at least a core of them that would be able to fund that that they would respect that change, adopt those changes. I do think that we are at a point now as a community where we have the opportunity to have that conversation, that we have the kind of critical mass, we have the kind of expertise, and I would really support the idea of our collective endeavor trying to find those big problems and trying to chase them down and pursue them rather than just treating symptoms. And I do think there are some efforts to already do that already, but I do think making sure that we take those very seriously is going to be important.
Yeah, and just, to add, I think the discussion we often have also at the European Commission, who are coming from this very kind of political level, is this is a wicked problem. It is a very complex problem because a lot of it is very ingrained, especially on research culture. I do think the fact that Science Europe is starting on these frameworks, value frameworks that are broader than one country, is getting us in the direction of what you've described. And I do think, as I said, research culture isn't a terminology yet that's accepted globally, but I do think if it becomes accepted, there will be efforts to bring that values piece there, and hopefully it won't be led by the global north. Hopefully it will be a much more co-creative exercise. And then the other point you make of, are the expectations too high of what can be achieved with some of these movements? I think they are. I think generally when and I'm again reflecting more on the research assessment reform. The unit that led that from the European Commission was the Open Science unit, because they started to progress the Open Science agenda and suddenly realized actually assessment is a barrier. If we don't reform assessment, we're not going to progress our agenda. But now I think they're going to start realizing soon that there's a problem with precarity that assessment isn't going to resolve, because you can, divert funding elsewhere, but the pot hasn't increased. So I think I agree with you that we haven't actually hit the core of the kind of problem yet, but I do think that some of these steps are necessary to get there and to get the ones who have the power to understand what the actual real core barriers are. So I think we will in the future reach a point where we'll have to just face the elephant in the room and come to those very kind of ingrained problems, but say if we don't address those, we're just not going to get the progress on all these other areas that we have set expectations for. So yeah, lots of work to do. Any other questions? I think there's one here.
Hi, how are you doing? Thanks. I'm one of those researchers or research officers who have kind of evolved into moving from research integrity support to research integrity and research culture and everything and anything that relates to it. I suppose the first thing I want to ask is more specific. In terms of the Science Europe framework, how does that align with the VITE framework for research culture in the UK? Are there commonalities or is there distinct focus?
There are commonalities, but I'm going to refer, I think there's James and Jolana, they're even sitting next to each other, are both here representing Science Europe and VITE, so I suggest you go talk to them about that one specifically. Do you want to answer?
Oh yeah, I can ask you afterwards. No, I suppose the other thing is that in trying to, one of my roles, and especially after the excellent conferences like this and the World Conference of Research Integrity, lots of frameworks, initiatives, projects around research culture and integrity across Europe, including Ireland and the UK. And is there a danger that the sector is becoming so dense with information? And information is a good thing, but I don't know about anyone else, but I find in trying to distill this and frame it in a way to present it to our researchers, to say, okay, you know, to engage with them in a co-creative way, what areas concern you, leaning into all these vast initiatives and frameworks. And I suppose that's just, it's becoming so dense. It's a challenge to try and contextualize it for researchers across different roles in an institution and disciplines in a way that can really embed research culture that's relevant to their area, their role, and their institution.
Yes, I agree with you. I do think the landscape is becoming too dense, and not only too dense. I think at the European level, there's also not really coordination of some the outputs of some of those projects, and I would even say there's not diversity, there's divergence. And I think that is a risk, because that means we're going in different directions, and that's the opposite of alignment. I think there's a place for diversity, but we have to avoid divergence.
And I think there's a danger of researchers becoming quite resentful of being researched on.
Exactly.
And, you know, being researcher fatigue, because at the end of the day, they're still left struggling with what they see, these kind of initiatives leading to increased bureaucracy, that they have to jump through more hoops to get funding. And, you know, and leading into research assessment, that actually it might just be easier to just strive for more and more publications and have those index factors than trying to jump through hoops to justify your existence through other more holistic means.
Yes, and I think, I mean, this is a risk of assessment, that it becomes an exercise where everyone has to do everything, which is not the intention. But of course, if that is not distilled kind of going through the system, clearly there's risks. So I think, I mean, one suggestion that I made to the Commission, who's overseeing a lot of the planning on this, is to actually direct more funding to the level that you're talking about. How do we distill some of this down to something that's understandable and manageable? I think the manageable part is important. Rather than creating more projects, should we dedicate resources to that, and also to create awareness with researchers at their existing events, for example, their existing disciplinary events, and inform them there.
The reality is that research culture teams within institutions, so like in our institution and other institutions, are very, very small, if not just one or two people. And trying to distill this information becomes next to impossible, because in the same time, you also have to bring in different areas from across your institution for meaningful change, like people involved in EDI, talking to people involved in research ethics committees, because there's a danger of them being siloed. So, and it's not to say that, you know, here's the Bible for research culture, but at the same time, there's such a huge, dense amount of information that's there. It is challenging to contextualize it for an institution.
Yeah, no, I think you make a very good point. I don't know, Ben, whether you want to add anything.
I think we've got time for one more question. Maybe?
Is there another one? I think we'll take that as probably the last question.
Hello, everyone. I'm Ollie Cox. I'm Head of Academic Partnerships at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. And I just wanted to ask a question around whether there are different generational expectations amongst the research community as to what a good research culture looks like, and how well equipped are we to deal with, say, you know, someone that's been in the role for 30-odd years as a senior lecturer versus people right at the beginning of their careers, and whether the data is suggesting any different expectations as to what kind of support and what kind of culture people actively want to work in rather than under sufferance.
Do you want to start, Ben?
Sure. I think certainly the answer is yes. There's definitely different expectations and different visions for what an ideal world would look like. I think there's also the challenge of people who've worked in a field for their entire career having a very, clear but quite set expectation of how it operates. I know when we did some of the welcome engagement, we obviously spoke to senior leadership at different institutions, as well as doing a kind of set of town halls, which brought together lots of different types of people from across an institution. And the challenge often for those close to the top is they've succeeded through a process, a landscape that has led them to a really good job, and it's led them to a really successful career. It's a kind of the classic survivor bias. And I think, not to say that those individuals aren't very self-aware of that at times, but it is a challenge, I think, to allow people in those roles to really step back and look at how things could be different. I think it's one of the benefits that we had of having the town hall structures that we ran was it allowed those senior people to hear directly from a whole mix of often people much earlier in their careers about both the experience they were having, which was often quite different from the one that the senior people had. The world was smaller, the funding was perhaps a little bit easier. I mean, it's not all rose-tinted, but there was certainly a sense that the challenges had changed and that pressure and the intensity of the pressure was higher, it was felt. But we saw a real shift in having those conversations, of going to a place where at times some of the senior leaders were a bit resistant to the idea of shifting things, to a place where actually they saw it as a win for themselves to steward that change and to see that through, and that their role was to empower the kind of early career researchers to have a say and to change things. And that was a real watershed moment actually in the conversation, going from one that was very resistive at times to one where those leaders saw a personal win, and we're all motivated by something that feels good, right? That it helps us and that does something good in the world, and actually really framing the change and the reforms as something that wasn't attacking the system that they had worked in or that had supported their careers, but that was, you're the stewards of this now. You get a choice about what you do for the next generation. And that was an incredibly powerful motivator, and it ended up with an incredible level of support from those senior people. So I do think it's a challenge, and I don't think we're necessarily saying that everybody has to agree on what the outcome looks like, but giving a sense of roles in that reform is really empowering. And if early career is about suggesting ideas and about coming to the table with thoughts, for those senior leaders it's about stewarding that process and guiding it to a successful outcome that's sustained. And I think that gives everybody a clear win for themselves, I think.
Yeah, and just one addition, reflecting on the work I did at the Royal Society of Chemistry, where we also developed a vision for science culture. We definitely saw distinctions between those more senior and earlier in their career, but there were also questions from the organization, because our focus has been also very much on increasing diversity, on what about those who aren't there anymore? What were their expectations from the system that weren't met, and why did they leave? And I think we try to engage people who left, but of course it's difficult to find them because they're obviously not in your kind of channels and networks that exist. But I think that is also an important question, to understand what are the expectations of those that felt those expectations weren't at all met, and they felt the best choice was to leave the system altogether. So another one, I think, to take away for more reflection today.